Good morning. Our text this morning begins in Matthew chapter 18. Matthew 18, verse 10. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. The sense of this parable, the parable of the lost sheep, I think becomes clearer in light of the teaching that Jesus gives immediately beforehand. All right, so he's been talking about these little ones. In fact, you see the metaphor of the parable is mixed a little bit. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. But then he switches to talking about sheep. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, don't you think he's going to go after that lost sheep? Well, what comes before connects these two metaphors together, the little ones to the lost sheep. So back up to the beginning of the chapter. Verse 1. At that time the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." This begins as a lesson on kingdom citizenship. In fact, this is itself another parable. He has set a child before them, but the child has significance as a parable. The ones who may enter the kingdom of heaven are those who are like this little child. In fact, notice Jesus doesn't initially answer their question. Right, they've asked who's greatest. He doesn't answer that question first. The first thing that he says is, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. All right, we're not even talking about greatest at this point. We're talking about who even is in. And Christ says, if you're not like one of these little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. This begins as a lesson about humility. They come to him and ask who's the greatest, and he tells them they're thinking about it wrong. Kingdom citizenship is about humility. And from there, he says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Again, noting that he's talking about the child in terms of a parable. Not just talking about literal children, but those who have humbled themselves, those who are citizens of the kingdom. He says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world for temptations to sin! For it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire. So the teaching and the parable are about how we treat citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Those who have humbled themselves, those who have turned and become like little children. And it is a lesson of woe for us if we cause them to go astray. Jesus says it would be better for you to just be cast into the sea. It would be better for you to be cut off than to cause one of these little ones, one who believes in Christ, one who has humbled himself before God, to go astray. And it would be better for you to be thrown into the sea or to be cut off because, and this is where we come back around to the text of our parable, because the angels are watching. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. Don't cause one of these to go astray. Because I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. In an earlier parable, in the parable of the wheat and the tares, we saw the coldness of angelic justice. Remember, the enemy has come in and he has sown these weeds in the field. In the interpretation of the parable, the angels have turned to the Father and said, well, let's just kill them all. All right, we've got this mixed people here. We've got some that are yours, but we've got a lot that belong to the adversary. Let's just kill them. Let's take care of this problem right now. And in the parable, the Father has to restrain them. We have seen the coldness of their justice. The description of the angels here reminds us of Gabriel as he spoke to Zechariah in Luke chapter 1. You remember what happens there. Gabriel goes to Zechariah first to tell him about John before he goes to Mary to tell her about Jesus. And in Luke chapter 1, as Gabriel has revealed to Zechariah that his wife Elizabeth is going to conceive and give birth to a son, Zechariah doubts. How shall I know that this will come to pass? You remember Gabriel's response? Just that little bit of doubt from Zechariah incensed Gabriel. And Gabriel struck him mute. Shut up his faithless tongue until the birth of John. You remember what Gabriel says in response to Zechariah's words. This is how he expresses his indignation. I am Gabriel, he says. I stand in the presence of God. As in, how dare you question what I am here to tell you? Right? God sent me to proclaim good news to you, Gabriel says. And this is how you respond to me? And so Gabriel strikes Zechariah mute. Our parable opens with the image of many such angels watching how we treat God's little ones. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. And so it would be better for us, rather than to lead such a one astray, that we would be cast into the sea or cut off ourselves. So how instead are we to treat these little ones, those who have humbled themselves before the Lord and who believe in his Son, the Messiah? Well, Jesus asks us, what do you think? How do you think you would treat such a little one? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Far from leading such little ones astray, it is our place to seek those who have gone astray. All right, Jesus has taken this and flipped it on its head. And it's not a coincidence, by the way, that the very next teaching is placed where it is. Jesus says, starting in verse 15, if your brother sins against you, that is, understanding this in terms of the parable, if he has gone astray, go, tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. We're supposed to understand this in terms of the parable. Right? What man having 100 sheep, if one of them goes astray, doesn't go and look for that sheep? He rejoices over finding that lost sheep more than over the 99s having never gone astray. So likewise, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. You have found a lost sheep. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. We sometimes look at this passage, we frame this passage as a teaching about church discipline, right? And the proper method to go through. It's basically like our, we might even call it de-escalation training, right? Because you start with the ideal and then you proceed through, well, what happens if this doesn't work? How do you escalate from that point? And sometimes whenever we frame it that way, that it is a passage about, a teaching about church discipline, we kind of start with the end in mind. Right? Like it's a passage primarily about what hoops you have to go through to get somebody else in trouble. Right? What all procedure has to be done first before you kick a troublesome person out. And that is exactly the opposite of Jesus' intent in this passage. It is primarily a teaching about going after lost sheep, and the aim is reconciliation. Because ultimately, the same standard applies to all of us. Right? Let's bring this back to the very beginning of the chapter. Who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Christ said, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And the one who is humble is seeking not after his own interests, but the interests of those around him. And so, of course, the one who belongs to the kingdom of heaven is the one who's looking out for sheep who have gone astray, to care for them, and to restore them back to their place. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. And so we call on all today. We must humble ourselves in the sight of God. Let us become as little children, not seeking our own glory, but the glory of our Father, not seeking our own well-being, but the well-being of our brothers and sisters. Let us be like this shepherd who goes looking after lost sheep because he cares for them, and because we know the will of our Father that none should perish. If you are not a disciple of Jesus Christ, you are that lost sheep. If you are not a disciple of Jesus Christ, you are perishing. And so we ask you to believe in the good news of Jesus Christ, that he gave himself as a sacrifice for sin. We ask you to turn away from your sin, to confess Jesus as Lord, and to be baptized into his death, burial, and resurrection for the remission of your sins. If you're subject to that invitation, won't you come as together we stand and sing?